The storm hit without warning, and Lyra Moonvale was already dying by inches before it did. She did not know that yet. All she knew was the fire in her own blood, the sweat soaking through her thin dress, and the fact that her hands would not stop shaking as she ground the last of her feverfew into paste. 3 days of illness had turned her small cabin at the edge of the Black Pine Woods into something between a sick room and a tomb. She had not eaten properly in 2 days. She had not slept in 1. And now, over the howling wind, she heard something that made her drop the mortar and pestle onto the floor. A cry, small, broken, not human. She told herself it was an animal caught in the storm, nothing more, and that she had no strength left to help anyone, least of all herself. But the cry came again, weaker this time, and something in her chest twisted so hard she gasped. She had heard that kind of cry before, long ago, in a healer's tent full of dying children. It was the sound of something that did not have much longer to live. Lyra pulled her shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the rain. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet. Rain came down in sheets so thick she could barely see the tree line, and thunder cracked close enough to rattle the shutters behind her. She should have gone back inside. Any sensible person would have gone back inside. But she followed the sound instead, stumbling over roots and stones, her bare feet going numb in the cold mud, until she found it half buried under a fallen branch at the base of an old oak. A wolf pup, small, silver-furred, no older than a season. His sides heaved with each breath, and when she knelt beside him and touched his fur, she felt heat radiating off his small body like a stove. His breathing rattled, foam had gathered at the corners of his mouth, and his eyes, when they opened halfway to look at her, were clouded and unfocused. "Oh," she whispered, and the sound was swallowed by the storm. "Oh, little one, what happened to you?" She did not wait for an answer, because there was clearly no one to give one. She gathered him into her arms, ignoring how her own strength screamed in protest, and carried him back toward her cabin. The rain lashed at her face the entire way, and twice she nearly fell, but she kept the pup pressed against her chest, murmuring words that made no sense even to her, the kind of nonsense a person says to keep themselves from panicking. Inside, she laid him on the wool blanket near the hearth and built up the fire with hands that would not stop trembling. In the firelight, she could see him properly for the first time, and what she saw made her stomach drop. His gums were pale. His paws, when she checked them, were cold, despite the fever burning through the rest of him. There was a faint discoloration spreading along the inside of his front leg, a bruised, sickly color that had no business being there. She had seen that color only once before, years ago, in a healer's manual her grandmother kept locked in a cedar chest. Poison. Not an ordinary poison either. Something rare, something meant to work slowly and without mercy. "Who would do this to you?" she murmured, and the pup whined weakly, as if trying to answer. She had no proper healer's kit anymore. That life had been taken from her the day her own pack turned its back on her, accused her of a crime she did not commit, and cast her out with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a bag of dried herbs she had managed to grab before the doors closed behind her forever. Since then she had lived alone at the edge of the Black Pine territory, selling salves and simple remedies to travelers who did not ask too many questions about her past. She had learned to survive on very little, but she had never stopped being a healer at heart, and a healer could not watch a dying creature and do nothing. She searched her shelves with desperate hands. Charcoal, for absorbing poison, but she had none fresh enough to trust. Milkweed root, but that alone would not be strong enough against something moving this fast through his little body. Her mind raced through every remedy her grandmother had ever taught her, discarding one after another, until she remembered something so old, so strange, that she had never actually tried it herself. Fever milk. Her grandmother used to speak of it in hushed tones, a technique passed down through generations of healers long before Lyra was born. When a healer's own body burned with fever, and she prepared a tonic while that fever still lived in her blood, something happened to the mixture that could not happen any other way. The heat of true sickness, her grandmother said, could carry healing energy into milk in a way that no ordinary hands ever could. It was rare. It was strange. Most healers went their whole lives without ever using it, because it required a healer to be ill at the exact moment a patient needed saving, and how often did such timing align? Lyra looked down at her own hands, hot and unsteady from her own fever, and understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside, that timing had aligned tonight. She moved quickly now, ignoring the ache in her joints and the dizziness threatening to pull her to the floor. She warmed goat's milk over the fire, added crushed moon herb sap, the only ingredient she trusted to fight venom of this strength, and stirred it with a wooden spoon, while her own forehead dripped with sweat onto the pot below. She did not know if this would work. She only knew that if she did nothing, the pup in front of her would not survive until morning. When the mixture was ready, she soaked a clean strip of cloth in it and knelt beside him. "Please," she whispered, not sure who she was asking. "Please let this be enough." She squeezed drops of the warm milk against his lips, coaxing him gently, patiently, the way she had once coaxed medicine into frightened children who did not understand why the taste was bitter or why it mattered. At first he did not respond. His body remained limp, his breathing shallow. She kept going anyway, drop by drop, whispering to him the entire time, telling him about nothing in particular, about the sound of rain on a roof, and the way stars looked on clear nights, and how brave he was for holding on this long. An hour passed, then another. Sometime near midnight, his breathing changed. It deepened, steadied, lost some of its terrible rattle. Lyra pressed her palm flat against his side and felt his heartbeat, which had been racing so fast it frightened her, begin to slow into something closer to normal. Relief hit her so hard she nearly wept, though she was too exhausted to manage actual tears. She kept feeding him the tonic through the night, refusing to sleep despite her own fever screaming for rest. Every hour she checked his gums, his paws, the color of the skin along his leg. Slowly, painfully slowly, the sickly discoloration began to fade. By the time gray light started creeping through the cabin's single window, the pup was sleeping peacefully, for the first time since she had found him, his small chest rising and falling in a calm, even rhythm. Lyra allowed herself to slump back against the wall, her own body finally giving in to exhaustion. She did not know whose pup this was. She did not know why he had been poisoned, or how he had ended up alone in the Black Pine Woods during a storm like this one. She only knew that she had done everything she could, and for now, it seemed to be enough. She closed her eyes for what she told herself would be only a moment. She woke to the sound of the door being torn off its hinges. Lyra's eyes flew open, her heart slamming against her ribs before her mind had even caught up to what was happening. Gray morning light spilled through the doorway, along with rain and wind and the enormous shapes of armed men filling the small space of her cabin. She scrambled upright, instinctively placing herself between the strangers and the sleeping pup on the blanket, though she had no weapon and no strength to fight anyone. "Don't move," one of them barked, and she found herself staring down the point of a spear. There were at least 6 of them, dressed in dark armor, marked with a crest she recognized instantly, and with a jolt of dread, a silver wolf's head, fangs bared, standing atop a broken chain. The mark of the Draven pack, the mark of the Alpha King himself. Her mind spun through every possibility, none of them good. Had she trespassed on land she should not have touched? Had someone reported her for practicing healing without a license from the royal court? Had the pup she'd rescued belonged to someone powerful enough to send armed men after a lone woman in the woods? Before she could ask any of it, the largest of them stepped through the doorway, and the room seemed to shrink around him. He was enormous, easily a head taller than his own soldiers, with shoulders built for breaking things, and eyes the color of storm clouds right before lightning struck. His dark hair was soaked from the rain, plastered against a face carved from hard, unyielding lines, a face that looked as though it had not known softness in a very long time. He wore no crown, no obvious symbol of rank, beyond the fact that every man in the room straightened the moment he entered. But Lyra did not need a crown to recognize authority when it walked into her home, and filled every inch of it with barely restrained violence. Alpha King Kael Draven. She had heard stories about him even out here at the edge of nowhere. Stories of a king who ruled with an iron will after losing his mate years ago. A king whose pack thrived under a firm hand, but who had not smiled, so the stories went, in longer than anyone could remember. She had never expected to see him in person, and certainly never expected to see him standing in her doorway looking as though he might tear the walls down with his bare hands. His storm-gray eyes swept the room once, cataloging everything, the herbs on her shelves, the cold hearth, the exhausted woman standing in a plain nightdress with dried mud on her feet. Then his gaze landed on the blanket by the fire, and Lyra watched something shift in his expression, something that cracked through the hard exterior for just a moment, before he mastered it again. "Rowan," he said, and his voice, low and rough, carried a weight she had not expected, not command, fear. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and dropped to one knee beside the sleeping pup, his large hands hovering over the small silver body, as though he were afraid to touch him, afraid that touching him might somehow undo whatever fragile peace had settled over the little creature during the night. "He's breathing," one of his men said quietly, disbelief evident in every word. "Alpha, he's breathing steady." Cale did not answer. He pressed 2 fingers gently against the pup's neck, checking his pulse the way a father checks for a heartbeat, not the way a king checks for a threat. Lyra watched his shoulders, tense enough to snap, ease down by the smallest fraction, and understood in that instant exactly who this pup was. Not just any wolf, his son. "He was poisoned," Cale said finally, and when he lifted his head to look at her, his eyes had gone from grief-stricken to something far more dangerous. Suspicion. Fury barely leashed. 3 days ago, taken from the royal nursery by traitors within my own walls, and when my men closed in on the kidnappers near the border, they poisoned him rather than let us take him back alive. We tracked him through 2 forests and lost the trail in this storm. He rose to his full height, and Lyra felt herself shrink instinctively under the weight of his stare. "I find him here," Cale continued, each word deliberate and cold, "in the home of a woman living alone in the woods, far from any pack, with herbs and poisons lining her shelves. Tell me, healer, why should I not assume you are the one who poisoned him in the first place, and that whatever you fed him through the night was meant to finish what the kidnappers started?" The accusation hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment, she could not find her voice at all. Around her, the soldiers shifted, weapons still raised, waiting for a single word from their king to close in. "I found him in the storm," Lyra managed finally, forcing steadiness into a voice that wanted to shake. "Half buried under a branch, poisoned already, dying. I did not do this to him. I have spent the entire night trying to save his life." "With what?" Cale demanded. "A tonic," she said. "Fever milk. An old healer's method. I do not expect you to understand it, but I swear to you, on whatever you hold sacred, I have done nothing but try to keep your son alive since the moment I found him." Cale studied her for a long, unbearable moment, his gaze moving from her face to her trembling hands, to the empty bowl still sitting near the hearth, with dried traces of milk and crushed herb along its rim. Whatever calculation moved behind those storm-gray eyes, Lyra could not read it, and she had never in her life felt so acutely aware of how easily this man could end her, simply by deciding to believe the worst. Then, as if to answer for her, the pup stirred. Small paws twitched against the blanket. A soft, sleepy whine broke the tense silence, and the little silver head lifted, blinking clouded eyes that were already clearer than they had been the night before. He looked around in confusion for a moment, taking in the strange room full of armored men, before his gaze landed on Lyra, and something in his small body relaxed instantly. He let out a soft sound, almost a chirp, and shuffled weakly across the blanket, until he pressed himself against her ankle, seeking the warmth and comfort of the person who had spent the whole night keeping him alive. The room went utterly silent. Cale stared at his son pressed against the leg of a stranger he had just accused of trying to kill him, and Lyra watched confusion crack through his hardened features for the very first time. "Rowan," he said again, softer now, kneeling once more and reaching for the pup, but Rowan only pressed closer to Lyra's leg and let out a small, unhappy whine, as though reluctant to leave the source of warmth that had pulled him back from the edge of death. None of the soldiers moved. None of them seemed to know what to do with a scene like this, a healer accused of poisoning being clung to by the very child she was accused of harming. Lyra herself did not know what to do. She stood frozen, afraid that any sudden movement might be misread as a threat, while the small pup nuzzled against her ankle and refused to budge. Cale rose slowly, his gaze moving between his son and the trembling woman standing over him, and something in his expression shifted from suspicion into something far more complicated, something that looked almost like the beginning of a debt he had not expected to owe. "Bring her," he said finally, and his voice had lost none of its authority, though it carried a note Lyra could not quite place. Both of them. To the fortress. Now. Alpha, one of his men, started to protest, gesturing toward Lyra with clear unease. If she's dangerous. If she wanted him dead, Cale cut in, his eyes never leaving Lyra's face. She has had all night to make certain of it. Instead, my son is alive, when every healer in my court told me he would not survive until dawn. He paused, something unreadable flickering across his features. Bring her. I intend to find out exactly what she did, and how. Two soldiers stepped forward to take her arms, not roughly, but firmly enough that she understood refusal was not an option. She did not resist. What good would resisting do against 6 armed men and a king who could likely snap her in half without effort? Instead, she focused on Rowan, who whimpered as the soldiers gently lifted him from her side, and she spoke to him in the same soft, steady tone she had used all night. You're safe now, she told him. Your father is here. You're going to be just fine. Whether the pup understood her words or simply recognized the comfort in her voice, he settled slightly in the soldier's arms, though his eyes stayed fixed on her the entire time they were carried out of the cabin and into the gray, rain-soaked morning. Lyra cast one last glance back at her small home, the only place that had ever truly been hers since her exile, uncertain if she would ever see it again. Herbs still dried along the rafters. Her grandmother's cedar chest sat untouched in the corner. The fire she had built through the night still glowed faintly in the hearth, and for a strange, aching moment, she wondered if this would be the last ordinary morning of her life. Then a firm hand guided her forward, out into the rain, toward a line of horses waiting at the edge of the trees, and toward a future she could not yet begin to imagine. Behind her, the door to her cabin hung broken on its hinges, swinging slightly in the wind, as if even it understood that nothing about her life would ever be the same again. The ride to the fortress took most of the day, through terrain that grew steadily more unfamiliar, forests giving way to open hills, and then to the looming silhouette of stone walls, rising against the horizon, like something out of an old story. Lyra had never seen the Draven stronghold up close before, only heard descriptions from travelers who passed through her small corner of the world, and no description had prepared her for the sheer scale of it. Towers stretched high enough to disappear into the low clouds. Walls thick enough to withstand a siege stood guard over a courtyard bustling with more people than she had seen in the past 3 years combined. She rode in silence, flanked by soldiers who watched her with wary eyes, while ahead of her, Cale carried his son himself, refusing to hand him to anyone else for even a moment. Lyra noticed the way he kept glancing back at Rowan throughout the ride, checking and rechecking that the small pup was still breathing steadily, still resting peacefully against his chest. It was a strange thing to witness, this enormous, fearsome king reduced to quiet, anxious tenderness by the sight of his sleeping son. And despite everything, despite her own fear and exhaustion, Lyra found herself softening slightly toward him. Whatever kind of king Cale Draven was to his enemies, he was, at the very least, a father who loved his child. When they finally passed through the fortress gates, the courtyard erupted into motion. Servants rushed forward. A woman who introduced herself hurriedly as the head healer, Madame Vessa, appeared with an entourage of assistants, already reaching for Rowan before Cale had even dismounted. Alpha, thank the stars, we feared the worst, Vessa said, her voice pitched with practiced concern, though her sharp eyes flicked toward Lyra with open suspicion the moment she noticed her. Who is this woman? The one who kept my son alive through the night, Cale said, handing Rowan carefully into Vessa's waiting arms, though Lyra noticed he did not let go until he was certain the healer had a secure hold. I want him examined immediately. Every symptom, every change, reported to me directly. Of course, Alpha. Vessa's gaze lingered on Lyra a moment longer before she turned and swept toward the fortress, with her assistants trailing behind her, carrying the still sleeping prince. Lyra watched them go, an unexpected pang of worry tightening in her chest. She had spent the entire night keeping that little pup alive, coaxing warmth back into his small body drop by careful drop, and some instinctive part of her did not want to let him out of her sight, did not trust anyone else to notice the small signs that might mean trouble. You will be given a room, Cale said, turning to face her fully, for the first time since they had left her cabin. Up close, Exhaustion showed plainly on his features, dark circles beneath storm-gray eyes, tension carved into every line of his face. Guarded. Do not mistake this for hospitality. Until I understand exactly what you did to my son, and why, you remain here, under watch. I understand, Lyra said quietly, and she did. She had expected nothing less from a king who had just watched his only child brought back from the edge of death by a stranger. Trust was not something that came easily to a man who had already lost so much. Cale studied her for a moment longer, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before he turned and strode toward the fortress without another word, leaving her surrounded by soldiers who escorted her, not unkindly, but not gently either, toward a small chamber deep within the stone walls. The door closed behind her with a heavy, final sound, and Lyra sank onto the edge of the narrow bed inside, her body finally allowing the exhaustion of the past 2 days to catch up with her all at once. Outside, she could hear the distant sounds of a fortress in motion, footsteps and voices, and the occasional bark of command, all of it foreign and overwhelming, after years of solitude in the quiet woods. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She did not know if the Alpha King would come to see her as a healer worth trusting, or a threat worth eliminating. She only knew, as her eyes finally drifted closed against her will, that somewhere in this vast stone fortress, a small silver pup was sleeping soundly because of her, and that fact alone gave her the strength to face whatever came next. Sleep took her before she could think another thought, and for the first time in 3 days, her dreams were quiet ones. Lyra woke to sunlight cutting through a narrow window, and for one disoriented moment, she forgot entirely where she was. The unfamiliar stone ceiling, the heavy wooden door, the distant sound of boots marching along corridors she did not recognize, all of it rushed back to her at once, and with it came a fresh wave of anxiety about the small silver pup she had left in the care of strangers. She rose from the bed, smoothing down her wrinkled dress, and found a simple meal waiting on a tray near the door. Bread, cheese, a bit of dried meat, and a cup of water. She ate quickly, unsure when she might be given another chance, and had barely finished when the heavy door swung open without warning. A guard stood in the frame, his expression unreadable. "The Alpha wishes to see you," he said. "Now." Lyra followed him through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, past tapestries depicting battles she did not recognize, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to track her as she passed. The fortress was colder than she expected, not just in temperature but in feeling, as though warmth itself had been carefully excluded from its design. She wondered, briefly, if that coldness had settled into the place after the loss of its queen, or if it had always been this way. The guard led her not to a throne room, as she had expected, but to a wing of the fortress that smelled faintly of herbs and healing salves, the healing wing. Her professional instincts recognized it immediately, the careful organization of supplies, the low murmur of assistants moving quietly between rooms, the particular hush that always settled over places where the sick were tended. Inside the largest chamber, she found Cale, standing near a small bed, his broad shoulders tense, his attention fixed entirely on the sleeping form within it. Madame Vessa stood nearby, along with 2 assistants, all of them looking distinctly uneasy. "Alpha," Lyra said carefully, unsure how she was meant to address him. "You sent for me." Cale turned, and the moment his eyes met hers, she saw something that made her stomach drop. Not anger. Fear. "He worsened in the night," Cale said, his voice tight and controlled in the way of a man holding himself together through sheer force of will. "The fever returned, worse than before. Vessa has tried everything in her arsenal, and nothing has slowed it." Lyra moved past him, without waiting for permission, her healer's instincts overriding any concern for propriety, and knelt beside the small bed where Rowan lay. In wolf form still, his fur damp with sweat, his small body trembling with the force of a fever that had clearly returned with a vengeance. She pressed the back of her hand to his side, and felt heat radiating off him, far worse than what she had felt in her cabin the night before. "This isn't the same fever," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else, her mind already racing through possibilities. "It settled last night. Something has changed." "We gave him everything in the royal stores," Vessa said, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. "Cooling herbs, calming drafts, everything a healer of my experience would prescribe. Did you give him anything new? Lyra asked, looking up sharply. Any food? Any water? Anything that wasn't given to him last night? Vessa's expression flickered, just for a moment, before smoothing back into practiced calm. He was given his evening meal, as always. Warm broth, a bit of goat's milk. Nothing unusual. Lyra frowned, filing the information away, even as her attention returned to the pup in front of her. Whatever had caused this new spike in fever, she did not have time to investigate it now. Rowan's breathing had grown shallow again, his small chest working hard for each breath, and the discoloration along his leg, that she thought she had banished the night before, had begun creeping back, faint but unmistakable. I need warm milk, she said, rising quickly. Fresh moon herb sap, if you have any in the royal stores. And privacy, if the Alpha permits it. Whatever I do next needs quiet, not an audience. Vessa's jaw tightened at being addressed so directly by a stranger in her own healing wing, but before she could protest, Cale cut in. Give her what she asks for, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Whatever she needs. The assistant scrambled to comply, and within minutes, Lyra had what she required, warming the mixture over a small brazier with hands that, mercifully, no longer shook from her own fever, which had broken sometime during her sleep. She worked quickly, adding the moon herb sap in careful measure, stirring until the mixture reached the exact consistency she remembered from the night before. But something nagged at the back of her mind as she worked. The fever milk had required her own illness to carry its healing properties, or so her grandmother had always taught. Without that fever burning in her own blood, would the tonic hold the same power? She had no way of testing this theory, except to try, and Rowan did not have time for her to hesitate. She pressed forward anyway, soaking a clean cloth in the warm mixture, and kneeling beside the small bed once more. Cale watched from a few feet away, his entire body rigid with barely restrained tension, while Vessa hovered near the doorway, with an expression that mixed skepticism with something closer to resentment. Come on, little one, Lyra murmured, coaxing drops of the milk against Rowan's lips, the same way she had the night before. You fought through worse than this already. You can fight through this too. Minutes passed with no visible change, and Lyra felt a cold thread of doubt creeping through her chest. Perhaps her grandmother's teachings had been wrong. Perhaps last night had simply been luck, a coincidence of timing that she could not repeat no matter how hard she tried. Then Rowan's ear twitched. It was such a small movement that Lyra nearly missed it, but she saw it clearly, along with the way his breathing hitched and then, slowly, began to deepen. She kept feeding him the tonic, drop by careful drop, and within the hour, his fever had begun to break, sweat cooling on his fur, as his small body finally began to relax into genuine rest, rather than feverish exhaustion. Behind her, she heard Cale release a breath he had clearly been holding for a very long time. How, he said quietly, moving closer to kneel on the other side of the bed, his large hand hovering protectively over his son's small form. How is it that you succeed where my own healers, trained for years within these very walls, could not? Lyra hesitated, unsure how much to reveal about a method so old and unusual that most modern healers dismissed it as superstition. But something about the raw vulnerability in his expression, so different from the cold authority he had shown her the day before, made her decide honesty was the better path. It's called fever milk, she explained quietly. An old method, one my grandmother taught me, passed down through healers long before either of us were born. When prepared while the healer herself carries a fever, the mixture holds a kind of restorative power that cannot be replicated any other way. I don't fully understand why it works. I only know that it does. You were feverish last night, Cale said slowly, understanding dawning in his storm-gray eyes. When you found him, when you made this. Yes. And today? My own fever broke while I slept, she admitted. I worried the tonic might not hold the same strength without it, but it seems something of the original preparation remained, or perhaps the method carries power beyond what even my grandmother understood. Cale was quiet for a long moment, studying his sleeping son with an expression Lyra could not fully read. When he finally looked up at her, something had shifted in his face, some wall that had been firmly in place since the moment they met beginning, however slightly, to crack. Madame Vessa, he said, turning toward the head healer, whose expression had gone carefully blank. From this moment forward, you and your assistants will assist this woman in whatever capacity she requires, but you will not administer treatment to my son without her direct involvement. Is that understood?" Vessa's composure slipped for just a moment, shock, and something sharper flashing across her features, before she managed a stiff nod. "As you command, Alpha." "And no other healer," Cale continued, his gaze returning to Lyra with an intensity that made her breath catch, "will be permitted near my son. Not without her presence, not without her approval." The declaration hung in the air, heavy with implications. Lyra was only beginning to understand. She had arrived at this fortress as a suspected poisoner, a prisoner under guard, and within the space of a single day, found herself elevated to a position of trust that clearly unsettled everyone in the room except the king himself. "Alpha," Vessa began carefully, "with respect, I have served this court for over a decade. To suddenly place a stranger, an unlicensed healer with no credentials, above my authority. My son is alive because of her." Cale cut in, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that silenced any further argument. "Twice now. I do not require further justification." Vessa's mouth pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing more, offering only a curt bow before gathering her assistants and retreating from the chamber, though not before shooting Lyra a look that carried far more venom than professional disagreement usually did. Lyra recognized that look. She had seen it before, in her own pack, right before everything in her life fell apart. She pushed the memory aside, focusing instead on Rowan, who now slept peacefully, his small chest rising and falling in steady, healthy rhythm. Whatever trouble her new position might bring, it could wait. For now, the prince was safe, and that was what mattered. "Thank you," Cale said quietly, once the room had emptied of everyone but the two of them, and the sleeping pup between them. The words seemed to cost him something, as though gratitude did not come easily to a man used to commanding, rather than asking. "I did not expect to owe a debt to a stranger I nearly condemned as an enemy." "You were protecting your son," Lyra said simply. "I understand that better than you might think." Something flickered across his expression at that. Curiosity, perhaps, or the beginning of questions he was not yet ready to ask. Instead, he simply nodded, rising to his feet with the careful movements of a man exhausted beyond measure. "You will remain in the fortress," he said, though his tone had softened considerably from the command he had issued the day before. "Not as a prisoner, as my son's healer, for as long as he requires care. You will have proper quarters, and anything else you need." "And after he recovers?" Lyra asked, unable to stop herself. "What happens then?" Cale paused at the doorway, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the light from the corridor beyond. He did not answer immediately, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that told her he had not fully considered the question himself. "We will address that when the time comes," he said, and then he was gone, leaving Lyra alone with the sleeping prince, and a growing sense that her life had just changed in ways she could not yet begin to predict. She looked down at Rowan, his small silver form curled peacefully beneath the blankets, and felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with fever, and everything to do with the strange, unexpected bond that had formed between them in a single stormy night. Whatever came next, whatever dangers or challenges awaited her within these cold stone walls, she found herself, for the first time in 3 long years of exile, feeling something dangerously close to belonging. Outside the window, the sun climbed higher over the fortress, and somewhere within its walls, unseen and unnoticed, someone watched the healing wing, with narrowed eyes, and a mind already working toward problems that Lyra could not yet imagine. 3 days passed in a strange, careful rhythm that Lyra had not expected to find within the walls of a royal fortress. She spent her mornings in the healing wing, checking on Rowan, who improved steadily under her care, his fever gone entirely by the 2nd day, and his energy returning in small bursts of playful mischief that reminded everyone around him that he was, underneath the royal title, simply a young pup who wanted to run and explore and chase anything that moved. She spent her afternoons learning the layout of the fortress, escorted always by a guard who never strayed more than a few steps behind her, though his presence had shifted from menacing to almost companionable by the 2nd day. His name was Garrett, a broad-shouldered man with an easy laugh he tried and mostly failed to suppress in her presence, and he answered her questions about the fortress with more patience than she expected from someone assigned to watch a suspected criminal. "You're not what I expected," he admitted on the third afternoon, as they walked along the upper battlements where Lyra had taken to watching the sunset, a small luxury she allowed herself after long hours in the healing wing. "What did you expect?" she asked, genuinely curious. Garrett shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "Someone dangerous. Someone who poisoned a prince and thought she could talk her way into the palace. Instead, I find a woman who spends every spare moment checking on a pup who isn't even hers, worrying over him like he's her own." Lyra's chest tightened at the observation, though she said nothing. She had not realized how attached she had grown to Rowan until Garrett said it plainly, and the truth of it settled into her with an ache she had not expected. She had lost so much when her pack cast her out, including any hope of the family she had once dreamed of building. Perhaps that was why the small silver pup had wormed his way so thoroughly into her heart in such a short time. "He's a sweet child," she said finally. "It's easy to care for someone who fights so hard to live." Garrett studied her for a moment longer, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before he nodded and let the subject drop, though Lyra caught him glancing at her thoughtfully more than once during the rest of their walk. That evening, as she made her way back toward the healing wing for one final check on Rowan before retiring, she overheard voices, drifting from a partially open door, sharp and hushed in the particular way of conversations meant to remain private. "Cannot simply allow her to remain," Madame Vessa's voice hissed, unmistakable even through the door. "She has no training, no credentials, nothing but some backward remedy from the woods, and the Alpha has placed her above me in my own healing wing." "The Alpha does as he pleases," a second voice replied, cool and measured, a voice Lyra did not recognize. "Perhaps you should focus on demonstrating your own value, rather than complaining about hers." "You don't understand," Vessa snapped. "If she remains, if the Alpha continues to trust her judgment over mine, what does that mean for my position here? I have served this pack for 11 years, Celine. 11 years of loyal service, and now a stranger from the woods threatens to undo all of it because she got lucky with some backward tonic." Lyra froze in the corridor, her pulse quickening. Celine. She had heard whispers of the name during her short time in the fortress, murmured among servants with a particular kind of careful respect that suggested importance. A noblewoman, someone had mentioned, closely tied to the royal family, though no one had explained exactly how. "Luck does not save a poisoned child twice," Celine replied, her tone thoughtful rather than dismissive, and something in the careful way she said it sent a chill down Lyra's spine. "Whatever she did, it worked. That should concern you more than her lack of credentials, Vessa. If the Alpha comes to trust her completely, comes to rely on her for more than healing, you think he has interest in her," Vessa said, disbelief evident in her voice. "I think," Celine said slowly, "that a man who has been alone since his mate's death might find himself vulnerable to a woman who saved his only child from certain death. Grief makes people foolish, Vessa. Gratitude even more so." Lyra's face flushed hot, despite the chill of the stone corridor, and she stepped back quietly, not wanting to be discovered eavesdropping on a conversation clearly not meant for her ears. But the words followed her regardless, settling into her mind with uncomfortable weight. She had not considered, until this moment, that her presence in the fortress might be perceived as anything beyond her role as a healer. The idea that anyone might view her as some kind of romantic threat to whatever arrangement existed between Cale and this noblewoman struck her as both absurd and, strangely, unsettling in ways she did not want to examine too closely. She made her way back to Rowan's chamber, with her thoughts still tangled, and found the pup awake and alert, sitting up in his small bed and watching the door, with obvious anticipation, the moment she entered. "There you are," she said softly, crossing the room to kneel beside him. "Were you waiting for me?" Rowan let out a happy chirp and shuffled forward, pressing his small head against her hand, in a gesture she had come to recognize as his particular way of asking for affection. She scratched gently behind his ears, and his tail, still weak from days of illness but growing stronger, thumped softly against the blanket. "You're getting better every day," she told him, smiling despite the heavy thoughts still weighing on her mind. "Soon you'll be running circles around this whole fortress and giving your poor father a heart attack trying to keep up with you." As if summoned by her words, the door opened again, and Cale stepped inside, his expression softening the moment he saw his son sitting up and alert, rather than curled weakly beneath his blankets. He crossed the room in a few long strides and knelt on Rowan's other side, running a large hand gently over his son's fur. He looks stronger, Cale observed, glancing up at Lyra with something that might have been the beginning of a genuine smile, though it faded quickly beneath his usual controlled expression. He is, Lyra confirmed. The fever hasn't returned in 2 days now, and his appetite has improved considerably. If this continues, I expect he'll be back to his usual mischief within the week. His usual mischief, Cale repeated, and this time, the smile actually reached his eyes, brief but unmistakable. You have no idea what you're wishing for. Before all this happened, he had discovered how to unlatch the pantry door. My kitchen staff nearly resigned in protest. Lyra laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise Cale, whose eyes lingered on her face for a moment longer than necessary, before he cleared his throat and looked back down at his son. I owe you a debt I do not know how to properly repay, he said, more seriously now. You have given me back my son twice over. Whatever you require during your time here, you have only to ask. Lyra hesitated, the conversation she had overheard still fresh in her mind, and found herself wondering if she should mention it, warn him of the tension already brewing among his court because of her presence. But something held her back, some instinct that told her revealing such a thing now would only complicate matters further, and perhaps put her in even more precarious standing among people who already viewed her with suspicion. I require nothing beyond what I already have, she said instead. A place to sleep, food to eat, and the ability to continue caring for him until he no longer needs my help. And after that? Cale asked, echoing the question she had asked him days before. What will you do then? Lyra considered the question honestly, for the first time since arriving at the fortress. Her cabin in the Black Pine Woods remained her only home, such as it was, but the thought of returning there, to isolation and suspicion, and the constant struggle to survive on the margins of a pack that had never accepted her, suddenly felt far less appealing than it once had. I don't know, she admitted quietly. I suppose I hadn't thought that far ahead. Cale studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful and unreadable moving behind his storm-gray eyes, before Rowan interrupted the silence with an impatient chirp, clearly displeased at being ignored for even a moment during his recovery. All right, little one, Lyra said, laughing softly as she turned her attention back to the pup, grateful for the distraction from a conversation that had begun to feel dangerously personal. I haven't forgotten you. The evening passed in comfortable routine, Cale staying far longer than Lyra expected a busy Alpha King to linger in a simple healing chamber, watching his son play weakly with a length of soft cloth Lyra had brought for him, occasionally exchanging quiet conversation with her about nothing of particular importance. It was, she realized somewhere during the visit, the first genuinely peaceful evening she had experienced in years, and the realization frightened her more than any threat the fortress's suspicious court could pose. Later that night, long after Cale had finally retired and Rowan had drifted into peaceful sleep, Lyra made her way to her own chamber, her mind still turning over everything she had heard and witnessed that day. As she rounded a corner in the dimly lit corridor, she nearly collided with a figure standing just outside her door, clearly waiting for her. Celine. Lyra recognized her immediately from the description she had gathered through overheard gossip, a striking woman with pale blonde hair and sharp, assessing eyes that swept over Lyra with the kind of thorough evaluation one might give a rival rather than a stranger. You must be the healer everyone speaks of, Celine said, her voice smooth and pleasant, though something colder lurked beneath the polished tone. I wanted to introduce myself properly. Celine Ashford. I've been close to the royal family for many years now. Lyra Moonvale, Lyra replied carefully, uncertain of the purpose behind this apparently friendly encounter. I wanted to thank you, Celine continued, for what you've done for young Rowan. The entire court has been beside themselves with worry since his disappearance. It's a relief to see him recovering so well. He's a strong child, Lyra said. He deserves the credit more than I do. Celine's smile sharpened slightly at that, though she maintained the pleasant facade. How modest. Though I imagine it must be quite an adjustment for you, coming from such a simple life in the woods to a place like this. The politics here can be rather complicated for those unfamiliar with court life. Alliances, expectations, promises made long before certain newcomers arrived. The implication in her words was unmistakable, and Lyra felt her spine stiffen despite her efforts to remain neutral. "I have no interest in court politics, Lady Selene. I'm simply here to care for a child who needed help." "Of course," Selene said smoothly, though her eyes told a different story entirely. "I only mention it because I would hate to see someone unfamiliar with our ways find themselves caught in complications they didn't anticipate. The Alpha and I have an understanding, you see, one that predates your arrival by quite some time. It would be unfortunate for anyone to misinterpret his current gratitude as something more significant than it actually is." Before Lyra could formulate a response, Selene offered a final, sharp smile and swept past her down the corridor, leaving behind an unmistakable warning that hung heavy in the cold night air. Lyra stood alone in the dim hallway for a long moment, the conversation from earlier and this fresh confrontation settling together into a clearer picture of just how precarious her position within these walls truly was. She realized with growing unease, standing at the center of tensions she had never asked to be part of, surrounded by people who saw her not as a healer trying to save a child's life, but as a threat to be managed, watched, and perhaps eventually removed. Whatever peace she had found in Rowan's small chamber that evening felt suddenly fragile against the weight of everything working against her within these ancient stone walls. She retreated to her own chamber and closed the door firmly behind her, but sleep did not come easily that night, her mind churning with warnings and implications, and the uncomfortable realization that her simple act of kindness in a storm had thrust her into a world far more complicated and dangerous than anything she had faced even during her exile from her own pack. Somewhere deep in the fortress, unseen by anyone, careful plans continued to move forward, plans that had nothing to do with gratitude or healing, and everything to do with power, position, and the lengths some people would go to protect what they believed belonged to them. Word of Selene's late-night visit did not stay contained within the quiet corridor where it happened. By the following morning, Lyra noticed subtle changes in how the fortress staff treated her. Servants who had grown friendly over the past few days suddenly avoiding eye contact, whispered conversations that halted the moment she entered a room. She said nothing about it, focusing instead on her work with Rowan, but the shift in atmosphere was impossible to ignore. Madame Vessa, in particular, seemed emboldened by whatever rumors had begun circulating. She appeared in the healing wing that morning with two of her assistants, her expression carrying a confidence Lyra had not seen since the day Kale first declared his decree about her authority. "I've reviewed the prince's condition myself this morning," Vessa announced, not bothering to wait for Lyra to arrive before beginning her own examination of the now much healthier pup. "His fever has broken entirely. His appetite has returned to normal. By any reasonable medical standard, he requires nothing more than ordinary care at this point, care that falls squarely within my expertise and training." "I agree his fever has broken," Lyra said carefully, entering the room in time to catch the tail end of this pronouncement. "But the poison that caused his illness in the first place has not been fully addressed. Silverroot, or something similar, tends to linger in the system even after outward symptoms fade. I would recommend continued monitoring for at least another week before declaring him fully recovered." "Silverroot," Vessa repeated, her tone carrying obvious skepticism. "A rather specific diagnosis for someone with no formal training and no access to proper diagnostic tools. The discoloration along his leg matches the pattern precisely," Lyra replied, refusing to back down despite the challenge in Vessa's voice. "I've seen it before, in my training with my grandmother. It's rare, but not unheard of, particularly among those wealthy enough to acquire such specific poisons." Something flickered across Vessa's face at that, quick enough that Lyra almost missed it, but she filed the reaction away regardless, uncertain what it meant but unwilling to dismiss it entirely. The confrontation was interrupted by Kale's arrival, his presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone in the room. He glanced between the two healers, sensing the tension without needing it explained to him. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice carrying the particular calm of a man accustomed to diffusing conflicts before they escalated. "Madame Vessa believes your son no longer requires my continued care," Lyra said honestly, deciding direct communication served her better than allowing the situation to fester unaddressed. "I believe otherwise, given the nature of the poison used against him." Kale's gaze moved to his son, currently attempting to climb over a folded blanket with the clumsy determination of a young pup regaining his strength, before returning to the two women. "What is your recommendation?" he asked Lyra directly, an action that visibly stung Vesa, whose jaw tightened noticeably. "Continued monitoring," Lyra said. "At minimum through the end of the week. I would also recommend investigating exactly how the poison entered his system in the first place, and ensuring no further exposure is possible." "That investigation is already underway," Cale said grimly. "3 of the traitors involved in his kidnapping have been captured and questioned. We know the poison was administered before we intercepted them, likely to prevent his safe return should we succeed in rescuing him. What we do not yet know is the exact substance used, or how it was acquired." "If I might examine any evidence gathered," Lyra offered, "I may be able to identify the specific poison and confirm whether continued monitoring is truly necessary, or whether Madame Vesa's assessment holds merit." Vesa's expression soured further at the suggestion, but Cale nodded immediately. "I'll have what we've gathered brought to the healing wing this afternoon. In the meantime, Madame Vesa, Lyra's recommendation stands. Continued monitoring, under her guidance." Vesa said nothing, though the look she directed at Lyra as she gathered her assistants and departed carried undisguised resentment. Lyra watched her go, with a growing sense of unease, aware that she had made an enemy today, whether she had intended to or not. That afternoon, as promised, a small collection of items arrived at the healing wing, gathered from the captured traitors during their initial interrogation. Lyra examined each piece carefully under Cale's watchful attention. A small vial with residue still clinging to its glass sides, a length of cloth stained with something dark, a handful of dried herbs that had clearly been ground for some purpose. "This," Lyra said finally, holding up the small vial and studying the faint discoloration along its interior. "This matches what I suspected. It's a concentrated form of silver root extract, combined with something else, perhaps meant to slow its effects and make detection more difficult." She glanced up at Cale, her expression grave. "This isn't something easily acquired by common criminals. Silver root itself grows only in specific regions, and refining it to this concentration requires knowledge that goes well beyond basic poison craft." "You're suggesting someone with resources helped them," Cale said slowly, his expression darkening.
"I'm suggesting," Lyra said carefully, "that whoever orchestrated this kidnapping had access to knowledge and materials that most people would not possess."
"Which means the traitors you've captured may not be acting entirely alone." Cale was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger, before he called for Garrett, who had been standing guard near the doorway throughout the examination. "Bring me everything we have on the captured traitors," Cale said. "Their associations, their movements before the kidnapping, anyone they might have had contact with within the fortress itself." "Within the fortress?" Garrett asked, clearly surprised by the direction of the investigation. "If Lyra's assessment is correct," Cale said grimly, "then someone with access to specific knowledge assisted in this plot. That knowledge did not come from common criminals working alone in the woods." Garrett nodded and departed quickly, leaving Cale and Lyra alone in the healing wing once more, the weight of this new revelation settling heavily between them. Lyra watched the king's expression carefully, noting the way anger, and something closer to betrayal, moved across his features in equal measure. "You suspect someone close to you," she said quietly, not quite a question. "I don't want to suspect anyone," Cale said, his voice rough with an emotion she had not heard from him before, something closer to exhaustion than anger. "This pack has been my responsibility since I was barely older than Rowan is now. I have tried to build something my people could trust. Something stable after losing my mate left everything in chaos for longer than I care to remember. The idea that someone within these walls, someone I trust, might have played a role in nearly killing my son." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought, and Lyra felt an unexpected wave of sympathy for this man who carried burdens far heavier than she had initially understood. Whatever cold, commanding exterior he presented to his court and his enemies, underneath it existed a father terrified of losing the one piece of his family he had left, and a leader grappling with the possibility that his own trust had been exploited by someone close enough to cause real harm. "You'll find them," she said, with more confidence than she perhaps had any right to claim. "Whoever did this, the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, especially when people believe they've gotten away with something." Cale looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way that made her breath catch unexpectedly. "You have remarkable faith in justice for someone who was falsely accused and exiled by her own pack." The observation struck her harder than she expected, and she realized, with some surprise, that she had never told him the details of her own past, only the vague fact of her exile. "How do you know about that?" "Garrett mentioned it," Cale admitted. "Apparently you've spoken with him more freely than you have with me. He seemed concerned about the circumstances of your banishment." Lyra considered deflecting the question, as she had with everyone else who asked about her past over the years, but something about the quiet vulnerability Cale had just shown her made deflection feel dishonest in return. "I was accused of poisoning a pack elder," she said finally, the old wound still tender despite the years that had passed. "He died suddenly, and I had been treating him for a minor illness in the days before his death. The pack's council decided I must have made an error, or worse, that I had intentionally harmed him, despite having no motive and no evidence beyond suspicious timing. I was exiled within a week, before I even had the chance to properly defend myself." "Do you know what actually happened to him?" Cale asked, his tone carefully neutral, though she could see genuine interest in his expression. "I have theories," Lyra said. "He had many enemies within the council, people who stood to benefit from his death and inherit his position and influence. But I had no way to prove any of it, not as a young healer with no standing and no allies willing to speak on my behalf." "That sounds remarkably similar to what may be happening here," Cale observed quietly. "Yes," Lyra agreed, meeting his gaze steadily. "It does." The parallel hung between them, unspoken but understood, and Lyra found herself wondering, not for the first time, whether the universe had some particular sense of irony in placing her at the center of another conspiracy so similar to the one that had destroyed her old life. She hoped fervently that this time the outcome would prove different. Their conversation was interrupted by Rowan, who had grown bored of his blanket climbing and decided to express his displeasure with an insistent chirp directed at both adults, who had apparently forgotten his existence for several long minutes. Cale's expression softened immediately, the heaviness of their previous conversation melting away as he moved to scoop his son into his arms. "Patience, little one," he said, though his tone carried obvious affection rather than reprimand. The adults were discussing important matters. Rowan responded with an unimpressed huff that made Lyra laugh, despite everything weighing on her mind, and for a moment, the three of them existed in a small bubble of warmth that felt entirely separate from the political tensions and hidden dangers lurking throughout the rest of the fortress. That evening, after Cale had finally departed with his son for the night, Lyra remained in the healing wing, organizing the various herbs and supplies she had gathered over the past few days. She was so absorbed in her work that she nearly missed the soft sound of footsteps approaching from behind, and when she turned, she found Garrett standing in the doorway, his expression unusually serious. "I found something," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone before stepping further into the room. Among the trader's possessions, a letter, unsigned, but referencing arrangements made with someone inside the fortress. "I haven't shown it to the Alpha yet. I wanted your opinion first." He handed her a folded piece of parchment, and Lyra unfolded it carefully, scanning the hastily written words within. The letter was vague, deliberately so, referencing payment for information about the Royal Nursery's guard rotations, and mentioning a meeting location that had since been abandoned. But one detail caught her attention immediately. A small symbol drawn in the corner of the page, a symbol she had seen before, embroidered on the sleeve of a particular noblewoman's dress during their tense confrontation in the corridor. "This symbol," Lyra said slowly, showing it to Garrett. "Do you recognize it?" Garrett's expression darkened as he studied the small mark. "That's the Ashford family crest. Lady Celine's family." The name hung heavy in the quiet room, and Lyra felt a cold certainty settling into her stomach, the pieces of a puzzle she had not even realized she was assembling, finally beginning to click into place. Lyra stared at the small crest drawn in the corner of the letter, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just discovered. She wanted, desperately, to believe there was some innocent explanation, some coincidence that would clear Celine of any involvement in the plot against Rowan. But everything she had witnessed since arriving at the fortress, the veiled threats in the corridor, The careful way Celine had positioned herself as someone with claims on Kale's attention painted a picture that grew more troubling the longer she considered it. "We can't jump to conclusions," she said finally, though her voice carried less conviction than she intended. "This symbol could belong to anyone connected to the Ashford family, not necessarily Lady Celine herself. A servant, a distant relative, someone hoping to implicate her falsely." Garrett nodded slowly, though his expression suggested he found the alternative explanations less convincing than she did. "Perhaps. But you know as well as I do how this looks. If the Alpha sees this letter without more concrete evidence, it could cause chaos within the court, especially given Lady Celine's long-standing relationship with the royal family." "What do you suggest?" Lyra asked. "I think we need more before bringing this to the Alpha," Garrett said carefully. "Enough evidence that there's no room for doubt or alternative explanation. Otherwise, we risk accusing someone with significant influence based on a single ambiguous symbol, and if we're wrong, the consequences for both of us could be severe." Lyra understood the wisdom in his caution, even as impatience gnawed at her. Rowan had nearly died, twice now, and the thought of the person responsible remaining free and potentially close to him again filled her with a protective fury she had not expected to feel so strongly for a child who was not even her own. "Then we investigate carefully," she said, quietly, without drawing attention to what we suspect. Over the following days, Lyra found herself paying closer attention to the rhythms of the fortress, noting who spent time with Rowan, who had access to his meals, who moved through the corridors near the nursery at odd hours. She discovered, through careful observation and quiet conversations with servants who had grown to trust her, that Celine visited the royal wing frequently, always with some plausible reason, checking on the prince's recovery, bringing small gifts, offering assistance to the overwhelmed nursery staff. None of it constituted proof of wrongdoing. All of it could be explained by genuine concern from a woman close to the royal family. But the pattern nagged at Lyra regardless, especially when combined with the veiled warnings Celine had issued during their first encounter. Rowan, meanwhile, continued his steady recovery, growing stronger and more energetic with each passing day, until he could barely be contained within his small chamber, insisting on exploring every corner of the healing wing with the boundless curiosity of a young pup finally feeling like himself again. Lyra found herself growing increasingly attached to him, spending hours playing simple games, teaching him small tricks, and simply enjoying his company, in a way that filled a void in her life she had not fully acknowledged until now. Kale, too, spent considerable time in the healing wing, his visits growing longer and less strictly necessary as Rowan's condition improved. Lyra noticed the shift in his demeanor during these visits, the way his guarded expression softened noticeably in her presence, the way conversations that began about his son's health often drifted into other topics entirely, her past, her training as a healer, small observations about life in the fortress that had nothing to do with medical necessity. "You seem different here than when we first met," he observed one evening, watching as Lyra helped Rowan navigate an obstacle course of cushions she had arranged across the chamber floor for his physical therapy. "More at ease." "I suppose I am," Lyra admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "It's strange. I came here as a prisoner, suspected of trying to harm your son, and somehow, I've found more purpose and connection within these walls than I experienced during 3 years of solitude in my own cabin." "Solitude wasn't a choice you made willingly," Kale said, more statement than question. "No," Lyra agreed. "It was forced upon me by people who decided my guilt without ever truly investigating the truth. I've spent 3 years alone, surviving on the margins, never quite trusting anyone enough to build the kind of connections most people take for granted. And now?" Kale asked, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that made her look up from Rowan's antics to meet his gaze directly. "Now," she said slowly, choosing her words with care, "I find myself trusting people again, despite my better judgment telling me caution would serve me more wisely." Something shifted in Kale's expression at her words, an openness she had not seen from him before, quickly followed by a flicker of something that looked almost like vulnerability. "I understand that struggle better than you might realize. Since losing my mate, I've built walls around myself that few people have managed to breach. My advisors call it strength. My son, I fear, has known only a father who rarely smiles, rarely relaxes, rarely allows himself the simple pleasure of enjoying a quiet evening without the weight of leadership pressing down on him. He adores you, Lyra said softly. Whatever walls you believe you've built, he sees past them easily enough. Perhaps, Cale said, watching his son tumble happily over a cushion with an expression of pure paternal affection. Or, perhaps children simply have an easier time forgiving our flaws than adults do. They fell into comfortable silence, watching Rowan play, and Lyra found herself acutely aware of Cale's presence beside her, the warmth radiating from him despite his usual controlled demeanor, the way his shoulder occasionally brushed against hers as they both leaned forward to catch Rowan before he tumbled too enthusiastically off the edge of his cushioned fortress. Lyra, Cale said eventually, his voice carrying a hesitance she had not heard from him before. May I ask you something personal? Of course, she said, curious, despite the sudden nervousness in his tone. When this is over, he said slowly, when Rowan has fully recovered and the danger to him has passed, what will you do? Will you return to your cabin in the woods? Lyra considered the question carefully, aware that her answer carried more weight than a simple discussion of future plans. I hadn't thought much beyond the present moment, she admitted honestly. My life in the woods was solitary, but it was also safe, in its own way. No one there expected anything from me beyond simple remedies for simple ailments. And here? Cale pressed gently. Here, Lyra said, meeting his gaze directly. I find myself wanted, needed, in ways I haven't experienced in years. It's both wonderful and terrifying in equal measure. Cale's expression softened further, and for a moment, Lyra thought he might say something more, something that would clarify the growing warmth between them that neither had explicitly acknowledged. But the moment was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door, followed immediately by Garrett's entrance, his expression tight with urgency. Alpha, he said, glancing briefly at Lyra before continuing, we've received word from the Border Patrol. Suspicious activity near the eastern woods, possibly connected to the traitors we captured. The Council requests your immediate attention. Cale's expression shifted instantly back into the controlled authority of a ruler, with responsibilities that extended far beyond quiet evenings in his son's healing chamber. He rose to his feet, pausing only briefly to press a gentle hand against Rowan's small head in farewell, before turning to address Garrett properly. I'll be there shortly, he said, before glancing back at Lyra with an expression that suggested their conversation remained unfinished, a promise for another time, when duty did not intervene. Thank you, Lyra, for everything. He departed quickly, leaving Lyra alone with Rowan, and a growing awareness of feelings she had not intended to develop, for a king whose life remained so entangled with dangers and politics she barely understood. She busied herself with settling Rowan for his evening rest, trying to push aside the confusing mixture of hope and anxiety that had settled in her chest since their conversation. Later that night, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion of another long day, Lyra decided to walk the fortress corridors, hoping the quiet movement might settle her restless thoughts. She had grown familiar enough with the layout by now to navigate without a guide, and she found herself drawn toward the eastern battlements, where she had heard Cale's council meeting was taking place, regarding the suspicious activity near the border. She did not intend to eavesdrop, told herself she simply wanted fresh air, but as she approached the council chamber, raised voices drew her attention despite her better judgment. Cannot ignore the pattern any longer, an unfamiliar voice was saying, tense with barely controlled frustration. 3 separate incidents now, each one connected to information that only someone within these walls could have provided. You're suggesting a traitor among the council itself, another voice responded, incredulous. That's a serious accusation, one that requires substantial proof before we act on it. The proof is mounting, the first voice insisted. Alpha, surely you've noticed the same patterns we have. Lyra pressed closer to the partially open door, straining to hear Cale's response, when a hand suddenly closed around her arm, pulling her backward with startling force. She spun around, ready to defend herself, only to find herself face to face with Celine, whose expression had lost all pretense of pleasant civility. Eavesdropping on council matters, Celine said quietly, her voice cold enough to send a chill through Lyra's entire body. How very unbecoming of a simple woodland healer. I wasn't eavesdropping, Lyra said, though the lie sounded weak, even to her own ears. I couldn't sleep, and was simply walking. Of course, Celine said, her tone dripping with false understanding. Just as I'm sure it's simple coincidence that you happen to walk past the exact chamber where matters concerning border security and internal threats are being discussed. Lyra said nothing, uncertain how to navigate this confrontation without revealing the suspicions that had been building against Celine herself. The other woman studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment, her sharp eyes searching Lyra's face for something, before a slow, unsettling smile spread across her features. "You suspect me," Celine said quietly, and it was not a question. "I can see it in your expression, healer. You think you've uncovered something clever, some hidden connection between myself and the traitors who nearly killed that child." Lyra's blood ran cold. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't insult my intelligence," Celine said, her voice hardening further. "I've survived within this court for far longer than you've been alive, healer. I know when someone is watching me, asking careful questions among the servants, examining evidence with suspicious interest. Whatever you think you've discovered, I suggest you consider very carefully before acting on it. Accusations against someone of my standing require overwhelming proof, and if you're wrong, the consequences will fall entirely on you." With that final warning, Celine released her grip on Lyra's arm and swept away down the corridor, leaving Lyra standing alone in the dim light, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and grim determination. Whatever game Celine was playing, whatever role she had truly played in the plot against Rowan, Lyra understood now, with absolute clarity, that she had made a dangerous enemy, one who would not hesitate to protect herself by any means necessary. She made her way back to her own chamber, her mind racing through everything she had learned and everything she still needed to discover, aware that the peaceful moments she had shared with Cale and Rowan earlier that evening now felt like a fragile illusion against the much darker reality unfolding within the fortress walls. The days following her confrontation with Celine passed in a state of careful tension for Lyra, who found herself watching every shadow, questioning every friendly gesture from the fortress staff, wondering constantly whether the noblewoman's threat carried more weight than mere intimidation. She continued her work with Rowan, whose recovery had progressed to the point where he could shift briefly into his human form, a small boy with dark hair like his father's, and bright, curious eyes that missed nothing happening around him. "He's ready for more active exercises," Lyra told Cale during one of their morning consultations, watching as Rowan attempted to chase a small wooden ball across the chamber floor in his human form, his movements still slightly unsteady, but improving daily. "His strength continues to return, though I'd recommend keeping him within the fortress grounds for now, at least until we're certain the danger has fully passed." "Agreed," Cale said, his expression thoughtful as he watched his son play. "The investigation into the border incidents continues, though we've made little progress identifying the source of the internal information leak. Whoever is responsible has been remarkably careful to avoid leaving any obvious trail." Lyra hesitated, uncertain whether to share her suspicions about Celine, aware of the potential consequences if she was wrong, but equally aware of the danger in remaining silent if her instincts proved correct. She had spent the past few days trying to decide the wisest course of action, torn between Garrett's advice to gather more concrete evidence and her own growing sense of urgency, given Celine's clear awareness of their suspicions. "Cale," she said finally, using his name without title for the first time, a small intimacy that did not go unnoticed by either of them. "I need to tell you something, though I worry about the implications if I'm wrong." His expression sharpened with immediate attention. "Tell me." She explained everything then, the letter Garrett had discovered, the Ashford family crest, the pattern of Celine's frequent visits to the nursery, and finally, the confrontation in the corridor that had left her with an unmistakable sense that Celine knew far more than she should about matters she claimed no involvement in. Cale listened in silence, his expression growing increasingly grave as she spoke, until finally, when she finished, he sat back with a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of exhaustion far beyond simple physical tiredness. "I suspected as much," he admitted quietly. "Not consciously, perhaps, but there have been signs I chose to overlook, because acknowledging them meant confronting a betrayal I did not want to believe possible. Celine and I have known each other since childhood. Our families have long anticipated a match between us, an arrangement I never fully committed to but never explicitly rejected either, out of respect for old alliances and, admittedly, a certain comfortable familiarity that required little emotional investment on my part. You don't seem surprised by what I've told you," Lyra observed carefully. I'm not, Cale said, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. Celine has grown increasingly frustrated over the past year, as I've failed to formalize our arrangement, particularly after word spread that I had no immediate intention of remarrying following my mate's death. She's ambitious, more so than I ever fully appreciated, and Rowan represents the primary obstacle to whatever plans she might have for securing her position through marriage into this family. The pieces clicked together with disturbing clarity. If Rowan had died during the kidnapping, and Cale, grief-stricken and without an heir, had eventually turned to Celine for comfort and stability, her long-standing claim on his attention might have finally solidified into the marriage she clearly desired. We need proof, Cale said finally, rising to his feet with renewed determination. Concrete evidence that will hold up before the full council, not mere suspicion based on symbols and patterns of behavior. If Celine truly orchestrated this plot, she will have been careful to protect herself from direct implication. Garrett suggested the same caution, Lyra said. Perhaps between the three of us, we can find what's needed without alerting her to how close we've already come. Their careful investigation continued over the following days, conducted with far greater discretion than before, given Celine's evident awareness of their suspicions. Garrett quietly interviewed servants who worked near Celine's chambers, gathering small details about her movements and correspondence that, while not conclusive individually, began forming a troubling pattern when considered together. Lyra, meanwhile, focused on the medical evidence, carefully documenting the specific properties of the poison used against Rowan, and cross-referencing what she knew about its rare ingredients with anyone in the fortress who might have legitimate access to such materials. It was during one such investigation, examining old shipment records from the fortress apothecary, that Lyra discovered something that made her blood run cold. A shipment of rare herbs, ordered several months before Rowan's kidnapping, included silver root among its listed ingredients, purchased under the authorization of Madame Vessa herself, though the requisition form bore a signature that, upon closer inspection, did not quite match Vessa's usual handwriting. She brought the discovery immediately to Cale and Garrett, spreading the requisition form across the table in Cale's private study for their examination. This signature, she said, pointing to the discrepancy she had noticed. Compare it to other requisitions Vessa has signed. The letters are similar, but something feels forced, as though someone tried to copy her handwriting without quite succeeding. Cale examined the document carefully, his expression darkening further as he compared it to other samples Garrett had gathered from the apothecary records. You're right. This is close, but not identical. Someone forged Vessa's signature to authorize this purchase. Which means either Vessa herself is lying about her involvement, Garrett said slowly, or someone with access to the apothecary's requisition process, someone familiar enough with Vessa's handwriting to attempt a convincing forgery, ordered this silver root under false pretenses. Celine has visited the healing wing frequently since Rowan's recovery began, Lyra said, the pieces continuing to align with disturbing clarity. She would have had ample opportunity to observe Vessa's handwriting, perhaps even access requisition forms directly during those visits. Cale's expression had grown darker with each revelation, and Lyra could see the internal struggle playing out behind his eyes, the difficulty of accepting that someone he had known for most of his life, someone his family had long considered a suitable match, might be capable of such calculated betrayal against his own child. We need to speak with Vessa directly, Cale said finally. If she's innocent of ordering this shipment herself, she may have information about who had access to falsify her signature, and if she's not innocent. He did not finish the thought, but the implication hung heavy in the room regardless. They summoned Vessa to the private study that same afternoon, and Lyra watched carefully as the head healer's expression shifted from confusion to alarm, as Cale presented the forged requisition form and explained their suspicions. I never ordered this shipment, Vessa said, her voice carrying genuine shock as she examined the document. This isn't my signature, though I can see why someone might mistake it for mine at first glance. Alpha, I swear to you, I had no knowledge of this purchase. Who else would have access to forge such a document? Cale pressed. Who visits the apothecary records regularly? Who might have observed your handwriting closely enough to attempt this forgery? Vessa hesitated, clearly working through the implications of the question, before her expression shifted into something like dawning horror. Lady Celine has visited my office on several occasions over the past few months, always with some plausible reason, questions about herbal remedies, requests for information about certain treatments. I never suspected. Alpha, surely you don't believe she would? I believe, Cale said grimly, that we now have sufficient evidence to bring this matter before the full council, and to demand answers directly from Lady Selene herself. The confrontation that followed would prove to be one of the most difficult moments Lyra had witnessed since arriving at the fortress, as Cale summoned Selene to appear before him and Garrett, along with several trusted council members, presenting the evidence they had gathered piece by piece, while Selene's composed facade cracked further with each revelation. This is absurd, Selene protested, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. Circumstantial evidence and forged signatures prove nothing definitively. Anyone could have visited Vessa's office. Anyone could have had access to that requisition form. Perhaps, Cale said, his voice carrying a cold authority Lyra had not heard from him before. But combined with your own admission to Lyra that you were aware of suspicions being raised against you, combined with your family's crest appearing on correspondence linked to the traitors who kidnapped my son, the pattern becomes difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. Selene's eyes flickered toward Lyra with undisguised hatred, and for a moment, Lyra thought she might attempt some final desperate denial. Instead, something in Selene's expression shifted, the mask of wounded innocence falling away to reveal something far colder and more calculating beneath. You have no idea what it's like, Selene said quietly, her voice carrying a bitter edge that suggested years of suppressed resentment finally breaking free. To spend your entire life groomed for a position, promised a future, only to watch it slip away, because a man cannot move past grief long enough to honor commitments made by our families generations ago. I did what was necessary to secure what should have rightfully been mine. The admission, delivered with such chilling calm, sent a ripple of shock through everyone gathered in the room. Cale's expression hardened into something Lyra had never witnessed before, a fury so absolute it seemed to radiate from him like physical heat. You would have let my son die, he said, his voice dangerously quiet, simply to remove an obstacle to your own ambitions. He was never meant to survive the kidnapping, Selene said, seemingly beyond caring about the consequences of her confession, now that the truth had finally emerged. The traitors were paid well to ensure his death appeared to be the work of rival packs, leaving you grief-stricken, and, eventually, in need of the comfort and stability I could provide. I never anticipated some woodland healer stumbling upon him, and somehow reversing what should have been an irreversible poison. Lyra felt sick listening to the casual cruelty in Selene's words, the calculated betrayal of a woman who had clearly convinced herself that Rowan's death was merely an acceptable cost for achieving her own ambitions. She glanced at Cale, whose hands had clenched into fists at his sides, his entire body radiating barely contained rage at the confirmation of everything they had suspected. Take her into custody, Cale said finally, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. She will face judgment before the full council for treason and attempted murder of the heir to this pack. As guards moved to restrain Selene, her earlier composure shattered entirely, replaced by desperate anger as she was led from the room. You'll regret this, she called back toward Cale, her voice carrying genuine venom. You and your precious healer both. This isn't over. The threat hung in the air long after she had been escorted away, and Lyra found herself troubled by the certainty in Selene's voice, the sense that even in defeat, the woman believed she still held some measure of power over their futures. But for now, the immediate danger to Rowan had been identified and addressed, and Cale turned to Lyra with an expression that mixed exhaustion with profound gratitude. Thank you, he said quietly, once the room had cleared of council members and guards. For everything you've uncovered, for everything you've risked to protect my son, I don't know how I can ever properly repay this debt. You don't need to repay anything, Lyra said softly. I only wanted to see him safe. Cale studied her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded moving behind his storm-gray eyes, before he stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the cool air of the study. Lyra, he said quietly, I find myself wanting far more from you than simple gratitude allows me to express properly. Her breath caught at the unexpected admission, and before she could formulate a response, the study door burst open, revealing Garrett with an expression of fresh alarm that immediately shattered whatever moment had been building between them. Alpha, he said urgently. "We have a problem. Celine's guards, the ones assigned to escort her to holding, they've been found unconscious near the eastern gate. She's escaped." The news of Celine's escape sent the fortress into immediate chaos. Cale's calm, controlled demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by the sharp, decisive energy of a leader responding to crisis, barking orders to seal every gate, search every possible route she might have taken, question anyone who might have assisted her flight. Lyra found herself swept along in the aftermath, her earlier conversation with Cale, the words he had begun to speak before Garrett's interruption, pushed entirely aside by the more urgent concern of a dangerous, desperate woman now loose somewhere beyond the fortress walls. "She won't have gone far without help," Garrett said, studying a map of the surrounding territory, spread across Cale's desk. "The guards were found with injuries, consistent with a struggle. But Celine has no combat training that I'm aware of. Someone assisted her escape." "Another accomplice," Cale said grimly, his jaw tight with frustration. "One we haven't yet identified." The search continued through the night and into the following day, but Celine had vanished, as though she had never existed at all, leaving behind only the unconscious guards and a fortress gripped by uncertainty about who else among them might have played a role in her treachery. Lyra returned to the healing wing to check on Rowan, grateful to find him blissfully unaware of the danger that had briefly threatened him again, playing contentedly with a wooden toy Garrett had carved for him during his recovery. Days passed with no sign of Celine, and gradually the immediate panic within the fortress began to settle into a wary, watchful calm. Cale doubled the guards around Rowan's chambers and insisted that only trusted staff be permitted near the young prince, a precaution Lyra fully supported, given everything they had learned about the depths of Celine's betrayal. It was nearly a week after Celine's escape when Rowan first showed signs of illness again. Lyra noticed it during their morning routine, a slight sluggishness in his movements, a reluctance to eat his breakfast that seemed unusual for a pup who had spent the past several days demonstrating a healthy, robust appetite. She checked him carefully, finding no fever, no obvious signs of poison, nothing beyond a vague listlessness that might have simply indicated a minor, unrelated illness common to young children and pups alike. But by afternoon, the symptoms had worsened considerably, and Lyra's professional instincts began sounding alarm bells she could not ignore. "His pulse is elevated," she told Cale, who had rushed to the healing wing the moment he received word of his son's decline. "Not consistent with a simple fever. This feels familiar, though the symptoms present differently than before." "The silver root again?" Cale asked, fear evident in his voice despite his efforts to maintain composure. "Perhaps," Lyra said, though something about the presentation nagged at her, subtly different from what she had witnessed during Rowan's initial poisoning. "Or perhaps something similar, administered in smaller doses over time, rather than a single significant exposure. That would explain the more gradual onset of symptoms." The implication settled heavily in the room. If someone had been administering poison to Rowan slowly, over an extended period, it meant the danger had never truly passed, that someone within the fortress continued to threaten his life, even after Celine's exposure and escape. "Who has had access to his meals?" Cale demanded, his voice carrying barely controlled fury. "The kitchen staff prepare his food," Lyra said, already working through the possibilities in her mind. "But someone would need opportunity to introduce poison without detection, someone with regular, unquestioned access to his meals or his chambers." They began an immediate, thorough investigation, questioning kitchen staff, examining meal preparation processes, checking every possible avenue through which poison might have been introduced into Rowan's food. Lyra worked tirelessly alongside Cale and Garrett, preparing fever milk once more to counter the immediate symptoms, while they searched for the source of this renewed threat. The tonic worked as effectively as before, stabilizing Rowan's condition within hours, but Lyra knew the relief was temporary if the source of poisoning remained unaddressed. Whoever had continued Celine's plot, whether an accomplice acting on her behalf or someone entirely separate pursuing their own agenda, remained hidden within the fortress, capable of striking again at any moment. 3 days into their investigation, disaster struck in a form Lyra had not anticipated. She was summoned to Cale's private study by a guard whose expression carried none of the usual respect she had grown accustomed to receiving from the fortress staff. When she arrived, she found Cale standing near his desk, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of confusion, and something that looked disturbingly like suspicion. "What's happened?" she asked, unease building in her chest at the tension evident throughout the room. "A search of your chamber revealed this," Cale said, gesturing toward a small wooden box sitting on his desk, one Lyra recognized immediately as her own medicine chest, brought from her cabin during her initial arrival at the fortress. Inside, nestled among her familiar collection of herbs and remedies, sat a small vial containing a substance that made her blood run cold with recognition. Silver root extract, identical to what had been used against Rowan. "I didn't put that there," Lyra said immediately, panic rising sharp and immediate in her chest as she understood exactly how damning this discovery appeared. "Cale, I swear to you, I have never possessed silver root in any form. I wouldn't even know how to properly extract it without significant risk." "Someone found it in your chamber," Cale said, his voice carrying a tightness that suggested he was struggling to reconcile the evidence before him with his own instincts about her character. "Hidden beneath your bedding, discovered during a routine search after Rowan's renewed illness." "I'm being framed," Lyra said, desperation creeping into her voice as she recognized the trap closing around her. "Someone placed this in my chamber, to implicate me, to shift suspicion away from whoever actually poisoned him." "Who would have access to your chamber?" Cale asked, though his tone carried less conviction than she needed to hear, an uncertainty that cut deeper than any accusation might have. "I don't know," Lyra admitted, her mind racing through everyone who might have opportunity and motive. "Anyone within the fortress, potentially. I don't lock my door, Cale." "I never believed I needed to." The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long, and Lyra watched with growing horror as doubt crept visibly across Cale's features, doubt she had not expected to see from a man who had, just days before, begun expressing feelings that went far beyond simple gratitude for her services as a healer. "I want to believe you," Cale said finally, his voice rough with obvious internal conflict. "Everything about your character, everything you've shown me since your arrival, suggests someone incapable of the calculated cruelty required to slowly poison a child. But the evidence, Lyra." "The evidence was planted," she insisted, though she could hear how desperate she sounded, how the very desperation in her voice might itself appear suspicious to those inclined toward doubt. "Please, Cale. You know me. You've watched me care for your son for weeks now, watched me risk my own standing to expose Celine's treachery. Why would I do all of that only to poison him myself?" "Perhaps to gain my trust," said a voice from the doorway, cold and calculating, and Lyra turned to find Madame Vessa standing there, her expression carrying a satisfaction that immediately raised Lyra's suspicions further. Perhaps this entire elaborate performance, exposing Lady Celine's involvement, positioning yourself as the prince's savior, was designed precisely to eliminate a rival and secure your own position within these walls, close enough to slowly finish what Celine began. "That's absurd," Lyra said, horror rising as she recognized the neat, damning narrative Vessa was constructing. "I risked my own safety to expose Celine. Why would I do that if I were working toward the same goal?" "To eliminate competition," Vessa said smoothly. "With Celine removed and discredited, you remain the sole trusted healer with access to the prince, free to slowly poison him, without the same level of scrutiny that might have been applied had two suspected healers remained under observation." The theory, while entirely fabricated in Lyra's mind, carried a twisted logic that she could see taking root in Cale's expression, uncertainty warring visibly with his earlier trust in her character. She felt the ground shifting beneath her, the careful trust and connection she had built over the past weeks crumbling under the weight of circumstantial evidence and a narrative constructed specifically to condemn her. "Cale," she said, forcing herself to remain calm despite the panic clawing at her chest, "please. Think about everything you know of me, everything we've discovered together. Doesn't it seem more likely that whoever assisted Celine's escape continues her work now, and has planted this evidence specifically to eliminate me as an obstacle?" Cale was quiet for a long, agonizing moment, his gaze moving between Lyra's pleading expression and the damning vial of silver root sitting on his desk. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying a weight of authority that made Lyra's stomach drop with dread. "You will be held for questioning," he said, "while we investigate this matter thoroughly. I owe you the benefit of proper investigation, given everything you've done for my son, but I cannot simply dismiss this evidence. Not when Rowan's safety remains at stake. "Cale, please," Lyra said, though she recognized the futility of further protest as guards moved to escort her from the room. "I'm sorry," Cale said quietly, and for a moment, genuine anguish flickered across his features, the conflict between his growing feelings for her and his absolute responsibility to protect his son, evident in every line of his expression. "I have to be certain, Lyra. I cannot risk my son's life on faith alone, not after everything that's already happened." She said nothing more as the guards led her from the study, her mind reeling with the injustice of finding herself accused once again of a crime she had not committed, the terrible echo of her original exile threatening to repeat itself in this new, far more dangerous context. As they escorted her toward the fortress's holding chambers, she caught one final glimpse of Cale standing motionless in his study, his expression torn between duty and something that looked remarkably like heartbreak. Behind them, unseen by anyone in the chaos of the moment, Madame Vessa allowed a small, satisfied smile to cross her features before schooling her expression back into appropriate concern, and slipped quietly away to send word to the one person still waiting, patiently and dangerously, for news of how her carefully constructed plan continued to unfold. The holding chamber where Lyra found herself confined bore little resemblance to the comfortable quarters she had occupied during her weeks caring for Rowan. Cold stone walls, a single narrow window too high to offer any view beyond a slice of gray sky, and a heavy door that locked from the outside, with a finality that made her chest ache with painful familiarity. She had experienced this exact feeling before, 3 years ago, when her own pack had condemned her without proper investigation, and the memory of that injustice now compounded with the fresh pain of Cale's doubt, however conflicted, cut deeper than she had expected. She spent the first day alone with her thoughts, cycling through anger, despair, and a stubborn determination to prove her innocence that refused to fully extinguish despite the bleakness of her circumstances. Garrett visited briefly on the second day, his expression carrying obvious discomfort at seeing her confined this way. "I don't believe it," he told her quietly, glancing back toward the door to ensure they weren't overheard. "Whatever evidence they found, I've watched you with that boy for weeks. You'd never hurt him." "Thank you," Lyra said, genuine gratitude warming through the cold despair that had settled over her since her confinement began. "Has there been any progress in the investigation? Any sign of who might have planted that vial?" "Nothing conclusive yet," Garrett admitted. "The council has called for a formal hearing, given the severity of the accusations against you. It's scheduled for 3 days from now." "A hearing," Lyra repeated, dread pooling in her stomach. "What happens if they find me guilty?" Garrett's hesitation told her everything she needed to know before he even spoke the words. Treason against the royal family, particularly involving harm to the heir, typically carries the harshest possible punishment. Execution. The word hung unspoken between them, but its weight pressed down on Lyra with crushing certainty. She had come to this fortress as a suspected criminal, and now, weeks later, found herself facing exactly the fate she had feared from the very beginning, condemned for a crime orchestrated by someone else entirely, someone clever enough to manipulate evidence and circumstance to point squarely toward her. "I need your help," she said finally, forcing herself to think practically, despite the fear threatening to overwhelm her. "Someone planted that vial in my chamber, someone with access, someone who wanted suspicion redirected away from themselves and toward me. I believe it's connected to whoever assisted Celine's escape." "I've been investigating that as well," Garrett confirmed. "No definitive answers yet, but I have noticed something curious. Madame Vessa has seemed unusually eager to promote the theory of your guilt, more so than the evidence alone would seem to warrant." Lyra's mind immediately connected the pieces she had been too distracted by fear to fully consider. She was the one who discovered the letter's connection, initially seemed uncertain about, and she's been consistently hostile toward my position since my arrival. Could she be working with Celine? "It's possible," Garrett said slowly, "though I have no proof beyond circumstantial suspicion, much like the situation you currently find yourself trapped within." "Then we need proof," Lyra said, urgency lending strength to her voice, despite her confinement. "Before this hearing, Garrett, please, I cannot face execution for a crime I didn't commit. Not again." Garrett nodded, determination replacing his earlier discomfort. "I'll do everything within my power. I owe you that much. At minimum, for everything you've done for this pack." He departed quickly, leaving Lyra alone once more, with her thoughts and the mounting anxiety of a hearing that would determine whether she lived or died. She thought of Rowan, wondering how he fared without her presence, whether his health remained stable, or whether the true poisoner continued their work unimpeded while she sat confined and helpless. She thought of Cale, the conflicted anguish she had witnessed in his expression when he ordered her confinement, and wondered whether any part of him still believed in her innocence, despite the damning evidence arrayed against her. The following 2 days passed in agonizing uncertainty, Lyra receiving no further word from Garrett about his investigation, no visits from Cale despite her desperate hope that he might come to speak with her directly, to offer some reassurance or, at minimum, an explanation for his decision. Instead, she remained isolated, her only company the guards who brought meager meals and refused to engage in any conversation beyond the barest necessary exchanges. On the morning of the hearing, she was escorted from her holding chamber to the fortress's Grand Council Hall, a space far more formal and imposing than anywhere she had previously visited during her time within these walls. Rows of council members and nobility filled the chamber, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile, as she was led toward a raised platform where she would stand to face the accusations against her. Cale sat at the head of the assembled council, his expression carefully neutral in a way that told Lyra nothing about his current state of mind regarding her guilt or innocence. Beside him, Madame Vessa occupied a position of prominence, her posture radiating confidence that made Lyra's stomach twist with renewed anxiety. The hearing began with a formal recitation of the charges against her: poisoning the royal heir, deception regarding her true intentions upon arrival at the fortress, and betrayal of the trust extended to her by the Alpha King himself. Lyra listened to each accusation with growing dread, recognizing how thoroughly the narrative had been constructed against her, how each piece of circumstantial evidence had been woven into a story that painted her as a calculating villain rather than the desperate victim of someone else's manipulation. "The evidence is clear," Vessa said, when called to testify before the assembled council. "The silver root found in her possession matches precisely the substance used against the prince. Her arrival coincided suspiciously with his initial poisoning, and her subsequent actions, exposing Lady Selene while positioning herself as indispensable to his continued care, suggest a calculated plan to eliminate rivals while maintaining unquestioned access to complete her scheme." "That's not what happened," Lyra said, unable to remain silent despite the formal proceedings that technically required her to wait for permission to speak. "I found Rowan already poisoned in the storm. I saved his life, not once but twice. Why would I risk everything to expose Selene if I intended to finish her work myself?" "Silence," one of the council members commanded sharply, though Cale raised a hand, gesturing for the man to allow her response. "Let her speak," he said, his voice carrying the first hint of the internal conflict Lyra had witnessed during her arrest. "She deserves the opportunity to defend herself properly." Grateful for the small mercy, Lyra continued, explaining everything as clearly and calmly as her racing heart would allow: the circumstances of finding Rowan, the fever milk remedy, her genuine efforts to identify the source of the poison, and finally, her absolute conviction that someone had deliberately planted the incriminating vial in her chamber to redirect suspicion away from the true culprit. "A convenient story," Vessa said dismissively, "but one entirely lacking in proof. Meanwhile, the evidence against her remains concrete and undeniable." The proceedings continued for hours, testimony after testimony, painting an increasingly damning picture, despite Lyra's attempts to defend herself, until finally, as the council prepared to move toward a formal verdict, the chamber doors burst open with sudden urgency. Garrett rushed inside, his expression carrying the particular intensity of someone who had discovered something critically important, followed closely by 2 guards escorting a young kitchen servant whose face was pale with obvious fear. "Alpha, forgive the interruption," Garrett said, breathing heavily from what had clearly been a hurried journey, "but I have evidence that must be presented before this council reaches its verdict." Cale's expression sharpened with immediate attention. "Speak." "This is Mira," Garrett said, gesturing to the trembling young servant beside him. "She works within the kitchens, responsible for preparing the prince's meals. I discovered, through careful investigation, that she has been receiving payment from an unknown source, in exchange for introducing small quantities of a substance into Rowan's food. Substance, she was told, was simply a strengthening tonic, not the poison it actually was. Gasps rippled through the assembled council members, and Lyra felt a surge of desperate hope as the narrative that had condemned her began to crack under the weight of this new revelation. "Tell them what you told me," Garrett said gently to the frightened young woman. Mira's voice trembled as she spoke, but her words carried devastating clarity. "A woman approached me weeks ago, before the prince's initial kidnapping even occurred. She offered payment for information about kitchen schedules, and eventually asked me to introduce a substance into his meals, claiming it was harmless, simply meant to help with his recovery from an unrelated illness. I didn't know it was poison. I swear I didn't know." "Who approached you?" Cale demanded, his voice carrying barely contained urgency. "I never learned her full name," Mira said, "but she wore fine clothes, clearly someone of noble standing. She met me only after dark, always in secluded corners of the fortress. But recently, someone else began delivering the substance and payment on her behalf, someone I recognized." "Who?" Cale pressed. Mira's gaze shifted nervously toward the front of the chamber, toward Madame Vessa, whose expression had gone rigid with sudden, unmistakable panic. "Her," Mira said, pointing directly at Vessa. "Madame Vessa has been delivering the payments and instructions ever since Lady Selene disappeared." The chamber erupted into chaos at Mira's accusation, council members rising from their seats in shock, voices overlapping in a confused mixture of disbelief and outrage. Cale's expression had gone deadly still, his storm-gray eyes fixed on Vessa with an intensity that seemed to freeze her in place, whatever composure she had maintained throughout the hearing, finally shattering entirely. "This is preposterous," Vessa said, though her voice carried a thin, panicked edge that undermined the confidence she attempted to project. "This girl is clearly lying, perhaps coerced by the accused herself, or her guard accomplice, desperate to shift blame away from the true culprit." "I have no reason to lie," Mira said, her fear giving way to a kind of desperate honesty, now that the truth had finally emerged. "I've been terrified for weeks, knowing what I unknowingly participated in. When Garrett found me, and explained what the substance I'd been giving the prince actually was, I knew I had to tell the truth, regardless of the consequences to myself." Cale rose slowly from his seat, his presence commanding absolute silence throughout the chamber despite the chaos of moments before. "Madame Vessa," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you will explain yourself immediately, and I suggest you consider very carefully the value of honesty at this precise moment." Vessa's composure crumbled entirely under the weight of his gaze, years of careful court politics and calculated position finally giving way to raw, desperate fear. "I never wanted him harmed," she said, her voice breaking. "Selene approached me months ago, promised me a position of far greater influence and security once she secured her marriage to you. I only agreed to help delay the search for answers, to redirect suspicion when necessary. I never intended for things to progress this far." "You knew Rowan was being poisoned," Cale said, his voice carrying a fury that made several council members visibly flinch, "and you said nothing. You allowed my son to suffer, twice now, and when the opportunity arose to eliminate an innocent woman for a crime you facilitated, you seized it without hesitation." "Alpha, please," Vessa begged, all pretense of dignity abandoned entirely, as the reality of her situation crashed down upon her. "I was afraid. Selene made it clear that refusing her would result in consequences. I couldn't survive within this court. I made terrible choices, but I never wanted your son to die. Your intentions matter little against the reality of your actions," Cale said coldly. "Take her into custody. She will face the full consequences of her betrayal, alongside Lady Selene, once we've located her." As guards moved to restrain Vessa, her desperate protests fading into the background noise of the chamber's continued chaos, Cale turned toward Lyra, his expression shifting from the cold fury he had directed at Vessa into something far more complicated: guilt and relief and lingering uncertainty, all warring for dominance across his features. "Lyra," he said, his voice carrying a rawness she had not heard from him before, "I owe you an apology, beyond what words can adequately express. I doubted you, despite everything you had shown me about your character, and that doubt nearly cost you your life." Lyra felt the weight of the past days finally lifting from her shoulders. Relief so profound, it left her momentarily unable to speak. She had come so close to execution, condemned for a crime she never committed, and the vindication of the truth, finally emerging, felt almost overwhelming in its intensity. "You had a responsibility to protect your son," she said finally, finding her voice despite the emotion clogging her throat. "I understand the impossible position you found yourself in, weighing evidence against instinct, duty against personal feeling. I don't hold your doubt against you, Cale, not when the stakes involved your child's safety." "You're more gracious than I deserve," Cale said, moving down from the raised platform where the council had been seated, to stand directly before her, close enough that the assembled nobility around them faded into irrelevant background noise. "I should have trusted my instincts about your character from the beginning, should have questioned the convenient timing of evidence appearing against you, rather than accepting it at face value. We found the truth in the end," Lyra said softly. "That's what matters most." Cale's expression softened further, something warm and unguarded moving behind his storm-gray eyes, as he studied her face with an intensity that made her breath catch, despite everything they had both just endured. "There is still the matter of Selene herself, still at large somewhere beyond these walls, and the promise she made before her escape, that this matter was far from finished. We'll face that threat when it arises," Lyra said, with more confidence than she perhaps had any right to claim, given everything that had already transpired. "For now, I only want to see Rowan, to ensure he remains safe and healthy." "Of course," Cale said immediately, gesturing for the guards to release her from the restraints they had placed on her at the beginning of the hearing. "He's been asking for you constantly since your confinement began. The staff have struggled to explain your absence in terms a young child could understand." They made their way together toward the healing wing, Cale's hand resting lightly at the small of her back, in a gesture that felt both protective and intimate, though neither commented on the closeness that had developed naturally between them despite the chaos of the past days. When they reached Rowan's chamber, the young prince, currently in his human form, looked up from where he had been sitting listlessly near the window, and let out an excited cry the moment he spotted Lyra in the doorway. "You're back," he said, rushing across the room to wrap his small arms around her legs, with the uninhibited affection of a child who had clearly missed her presence terribly. "Papa said you had important business, but I was worried." Lyra knelt down to properly embrace him, tears she had been holding back throughout the tense hearing, finally spilling free at the simple, unguarded love in the child's greeting. "I'm here now," she said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." She glanced up to find Cale watching them both with an expression of such profound tenderness that her heart ached with the weight of feelings she had tried, unsuccessfully, to suppress since her arrival at the fortress weeks ago. Whatever complicated politics and dangers still surrounded their lives, whatever threat Selene's continued freedom posed to their future, in this moment, surrounded by the warmth of Rowan's affection and Cale's clear devotion, Lyra felt something she had not experienced in years. She felt, for the first time since her exile began, that she had finally found a place where she truly belonged. Word of Selene's capture arrived nearly 2 weeks after the hearing that cleared Lyra's name entirely. She had been found hiding in a distant territory, having sought refuge with distant relatives who, once questioned by Cale's soldiers, quickly revealed her location, rather than risk implicating themselves further in her treachery. She was returned to the fortress in chains, her earlier confidence and calculated composure entirely stripped away by weeks of desperate flight and the crushing weight of inevitable justice finally catching up to her. The formal judgment against both Selene and Madame Vessa took place before the full council, and unlike the chaotic hearing that had nearly condemned Lyra, this proceeding moved forward with clear, damning evidence that left no room for doubt or manipulation. Selene, stripped of her noble standing and any remaining influence within the court, was sentenced to permanent exile from the Draven territories, forbidden from ever again setting foot within lands under Cale's protection. Vessa, whose cooperation with the investigation and evident remorse tempered the severity of her punishment somewhat, received a lesser sentence of exile as well, though she would carry the weight of her betrayal and the consequences of her choices for the remainder of her life. With both women removed from any position of influence or threat, a sense of genuine peace finally began settling over the fortress, one that Lyra had not realized she craved until she felt it taking root within her chest. Rowan continued his recovery with steady, joyful progress, his health fully restored, and his energy returning to the boundless enthusiasm of a young pup no longer burdened by illness or danger. Lyra found herself increasingly integrated into the daily rhythms of fortress life, no longer viewed with suspicion by the staff and nobility who had once regarded her with wary uncertainty, but instead welcomed with genuine warmth and respect for everything she had endured and accomplished during her time within these walls. She continued her role as Rowan's primary healer, though the position had evolved into something far more significant than simple medical care, a role that included teaching him small lessons about herbs and healing, playing games that helped strengthen his recovering body, and providing the kind of steady, loving presence that Cale had struggled to offer consistently, given the demands of his position as Alpha King. Word of her exoneration had spread beyond the fortress walls, eventually reaching even the distant pack that had once condemned her to exile without proper investigation. Lyra received an unexpected message one afternoon, delivered by a messenger from her former pack's council, formally acknowledging that new evidence had emerged proving her innocence regarding the elder's death years ago. Evidence that implicated the very council members who had once been quickest to condemn her. The message included a formal apology and an invitation to return home, should she wish to reclaim her former standing within the pack. She read the message with complicated emotions, vindication mixing with lingering hurt at the years of unjust exile she had endured, before setting it aside with a clarity that surprised her. Whatever home she had once imagined returning to no longer held the same appeal it might have years ago. She had found something far more meaningful within the walls of the Draven Fortress, connections and purpose that made the idea of returning to her old life feel distant and unnecessary. "You're smiling," Cale observed one evening, finding her in the garden where she had taken to spending quiet moments after long days caring for Rowan. "What has captured your thoughts so pleasantly?" She explained the message from her former pack, watching his expression shift through several emotions: surprise, indignation on her behalf, and finally, a kind of hopeful curiosity about her ultimate decision. "Will you return?" he asked, his voice carrying a carefully controlled neutrality that did not quite mask the genuine concern beneath. "No," Lyra said simply, watching relief flood visibly across his features before he could fully suppress it. "I have no desire to return to a place that abandoned me so easily, especially now that I've found something far more valuable here." "And what is that?" Cale asked, moving closer, his storm-gray eyes carrying a warmth that had become increasingly familiar over the past weeks, since the true danger to their lives had finally passed. "Purpose," Lyra said softly. "Connection. A little boy who has become as dear to me as if he were my own child, and—" She hesitated, uncertain how much honesty to risk in this moment. "And?" Cale prompted gently, close enough now that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool evening air. "And a man," she continued, gathering her courage, "whose strength and devotion to his people, and to his son, has shown me a kind of leadership and character I never expected to find, and certainly never expected to fall for." Cale's expression transformed entirely at her admission, the careful control he maintained in most situations giving way to something raw and unguarded. Joy, mixed with a vulnerability that reminded her of the frightened father she had first encountered in her cabin weeks ago, desperate to save his dying son. "Lyra," he said, his voice carrying a depth of emotion that made her breath catch. "Since the moment I watched you save my son's life in that storm, something shifted within me that I had believed impossible since losing my mate. I did not expect to find myself capable of such feelings again, certainly not so quickly, and certainly not for a woman who arrived in my life under such extraordinary circumstances, but I find myself unable to imagine my future, or Rowan's future, without you as an essential part of it." "Cale," she whispered, tears gathering unexpectedly at the raw honesty of his declaration. "I know our circumstances have been complicated," he continued, "filled with danger and betrayal and doubt that nearly cost us both everything. But through all of it, you have remained steady, honest, and devoted to protecting those you care for, even at tremendous personal risk. I would be honored, more than I can properly express, if you would consider staying here, not simply as Rowan's healer, but as something far more permanent within our lives." He reached for her hand, his large fingers wrapping gently around hers, and Lyra felt the warmth of his touch, settling something deep within her chest that had remained unsettled since her exile began years ago. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" she said softly, hope and disbelief mingling in equal measure. "I am asking," Cale said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability evident in his expression, "if you would consider becoming my mate, and Rowan's mother in every sense that matters, not simply his healer or his caretaker, but someone bound to this family permanently, someone I can build a future alongside, someone Rowan can grow up knowing loves him as completely as I do." Lyra felt the weight of years of loneliness and exile finally lifting entirely from her shoulders, replaced by a happiness so profound it left her momentarily speechless. She had arrived at this fortress as a suspected criminal, weathered accusations and danger that nearly cost her life, and yet somehow found her way to this exact moment, standing in a quiet garden, with a man whose strength and vulnerability had captured her heart, despite every obstacle placed between them. "Yes," she said finally, joy breaking through in her voice, as tears of happiness finally spilled free. "Yes, Cale, I would be honored beyond words to become your mate, to help raise Rowan, to build a life alongside you both." The kiss that followed sealed a promise that had been building steadily since the night she first found a poisoned pup shivering in a storm, a promise between a healer who had once known only exile and suspicion, and a king who had learned to trust his heart again after years of careful, guarded solitude. Their bonding ceremony took place several weeks later, a celebration that drew nobility and common folk alike from across the Draven territories, all eager to witness the joining of their Alpha King, with the healer who had saved his son not once, but multiple times, and who had endured false accusation and near execution, with a grace and strength that had earned genuine respect throughout the pack. Rowan, now fully grown into his health and boundless energy, served as an enthusiastic, if occasionally disruptive, participant in the ceremony, refusing to release Lyra's hand throughout much of the proceedings, as though afraid that letting go might somehow undo the happiness that had finally settled into their small, unconventional family. "You may kiss your mate," the officiant announced, and Cale did so with a tenderness that drew appreciative murmurs from the assembled crowd, his hands cupping Lyra's face with a gentleness that belied his fearsome reputation as an unyielding Alpha King. As the celebration continued into the evening, with feasting and music filling the fortress courtyard, Lyra found herself standing at the edge of the festivities, watching Rowan chase other pups his age across the grass, while Cale spoke warmly with council members and nobility, who had once regarded her with suspicion, but now approached with genuine respect and affection. She thought back to that stormy night months ago, huddled in her small cabin with a dying pup in her arms, uncertain if her efforts would prove enough to save his life. She could never have imagined then that a single act of desperate kindness would lead her to this exact moment. Surrounded by warmth and belonging, she had believed lost to her forever after her exile. Cale appeared beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist as he followed her gaze toward Rowan's joyful play. "Regrets?" he asked softly, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. "None," Lyra said, leaning into his warmth with a contentment she had never expected to feel again. "Only gratitude, for the storm that led me to you both. And I," Cale said, pressing a gentle kiss against her temple, "will remain eternally grateful that no other healer will ever again be needed near my family, not while you remain by our side." As the sun set over the Draven fortress, casting warm golden light across the celebrating crowd, Lyra allowed herself to fully embrace the happiness she had found, a happiness built from tragedy and danger, but strengthened into something unbreakable through trust, courage, and the simple, powerful act of choosing to help a stranger in need during the darkest moments of a raging storm. The healer once cast aside by her own people had found not just acceptance, but a family entirely her own, and a love that would carry her forward into a future brighter than anything she had dared imagine during her years of lonely exile in the Black Pine Woods.